officially.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Kristen Peekole, and I am part of an amazing team at the American Library Association, specifically the Office for Intellectual Freedom. We fight back against censorship of books, resources, and services in libraries and schools. And we help librarians and teachers defend intellectual freedom and the First Amendment rights of students and people in their community. This week, we are celebrating Banned Books Week. What is Banned Books Week, you ask? Banned Books Week was launched in 1982 in response to a sudden surge in the number of challenges to books in schools, bookstores, universities, and libraries. Unfortunately, those challenges haven't abated. So Banned Books Week continues to bring together the entire book community. Libraries, educators, booksellers, publishers, journalists, authors, artists, and readers of all types, in shared support of the freedom to read. The theme of this year's event is Censorship is a Dead End. Find your freedom to read, to explore, to discover who you are, to see the world around you through books and information. This also happens to be my favorite time of year. I love spooky stories and decorating pumpkins, trick-or-treating, and haunted houses. Anything that helps me jump out of my skin. I grew up reading these scary stories. R.L. Stine, Christopher Pike, and Alvin Schwartz. I'm so excited and honored to be a part of this project, and I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Cody Meirick. Cody, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name's Cody Meirick. I live in the Chicago area. Have a background in media and web, and kind of got it in my head that I wanted to take on a documentary subject for a first film, and I decided on that. Oh gosh, I mean the film's been released for over a year now. The whole process was about 5 years, and so it definitely it took a lot of time, but yeah, and it was a great experience for me, and I don't know. There's a lot of learning that goes along with doing a film, especially your first film, and it was it was a fantastic experience, just kind of meeting all the people that I did and going through that experience, especially again. It didn't happen overnight. It was, so I learned so much about all kinds of individual things, as well as just the topic in general. And so, yeah, it was a great experience.
So I have a bunch of questions for Cody just to get us started, but I really want to hear from questions that our audience has as well. So if there are questions from people that are watching the live Q&A, please add them to the YouTube comments, or add them on Twitter with the hashtag censorship_is_scary, and we'll do our best to add them into the conversation. So Cody, obviously my first question for you is going to be about why this series of books. You said you wanted to start out with a documentary, but what drew you to scary stories?
So my background is in children's literature, basically, and I have an interest in that, and so that made a lot of sense to do something in children's literature, and basically, with the idea that the purpose, the underpinning idea is the importance of kids' literature, the importance of getting kids reading, right? And so, but that's not a story. You need a story. And then I thought of these books, and then first and foremost, I saw the story. Like I could see, okay, I don't know exactly, you know, I don't know all the details of the story, but there is a story here. I saw that, okay, they're wildly popular. They're a big nostalgia title for a lot of people. There's tons of stories that go into all kinds of folklore and interesting aspects of our culture, along with the fact that they were challenged so heavily. They were the #1 most challenged books of the 1990s. And so you juxtapose those two things together, it's like, okay, that's a story. I don't again know all the details of the story, but I knew that I was in a unique place to kind of, you know, see all of the different pieces of it and say, okay, I can tell the story, yeah, so that's pretty much, you know, how things started. But again, when it's spread out over 5 years or so, then it's like you learn different pieces of it along the way, for sure.
Were there details? I know you had said you knew the story, you had the story in your head, but that you didn't know all the details. So were there details that surprised you as you were doing interviews and research?
Sure. Well, certainly, you know, very early on, I didn't have involvement from the Schwartz family, but that happened relatively soon within the first 6 months. Once that happened, then it was kind of figuring out what and how. There's a story there, and you know the author passed away a long time ago, but I wanted this to be kind of, as much as it could be, the definitive story. So okay, let's you know figure out how to involve the people who, you know, brought about the books, you know, involve them as much as possible, and get to know them, because that's what I felt like people want. They want to learn about, you know, these are books. It's not a movie. I can't, you know, we can't look at footage. I can't adapt the stories. There was a different movie that did that. So, getting to in the headspace of, as much as possible, the author and the illustrator. But yeah, I mean, how it developed as far as with Peter Schwartz and his story and everything, that I didn't know. I mean, that until you kind of get in there, and more, you know, just pouring through the, you know, hours and hours and hours of footage and things that we were looking at, that story that, you know, where it happened in Seattle and Peter Schwartz was in Seattle, that just like perfectly gelled together in my mind, as far as, okay, here's the you know, #1 case of, you know, these books being challenged, made national news, and it was right around the time the author passed away. And here's a PTA mother who wanted to confront him and never did. And Peter Schwartz is there in Seattle, so that just like, okay, that became the story. I mean, to me, you know, it was, I was doing all these other things to help fill out a certain amount of what I think people want to see, but B, what I wanted to see. I mean, what I was interested in. But then, you know, how it all worked out with Peter Schwartz and his story, as well as, you know, actually finding Sandy, who was not an easy find, but eventually I found her, and she had not changed that much over the years. That's something I definitely learned along the way, and was happy it I don't know, arguably brought a certain amount of closure, or at the very least, like, you know, people learn about it, a particular case, because you know, that's what I think a documentary does differently than other things. I mean, you know, all the more respect to the ALA and them putting together a list every single year. A list isn't a documentary. A documentary
Absolutely.
is like, okay, here, you know, the people need to see that list, you know, and so on and so forth, and talk about it and so on. But a documentary is a totally different beast. It's like, that's the time to actually go into a particular case and really, you know, and get the people involved in that particular case and really, you know, get under the hood.
Yeah. When we hear the stories from the people who went through the challenges, whether it's in written form, though I think it's best when they're telling their own story verbally, and you see that emotion on their face. it's so much more powerful than any list or any 3-sentence blurb on a pamphlet's going to do.
Sure.
It's so powerful. So how did you find her? And was she defensive? Was she willing to?
More than any other interview. I mean, okay, here's the excuse me. Here's the two trickiest interviews. One was R.L. Stine, because he's R.L. Stine, and it's not like I could just ring him up. Hey, you want to have a conversation with me? He's the kind of the mega star of the genre. So there's that. But then a totally different experience is Sandy and finding her. Yeah, she did not live in Seattle anymore. She had moved to California. It was just a lot of searching, and finally I found a picture, and her name had changed, and so that was pretty difficult. So I remember walking up to my wife and saying, showing the picture of her from the footage, 25 years ago or so, and a picture of her now, and it's like, is this the same person 25 years apart or whatever? And it was, and I reached out to her. But that was also like, it was sensitive because I wanted to give her a voice. I didn't want to come across as, and it was something a number of people have told me over time, is that, I try not to be too judgy or preachy. The idea is to let them give their opinion and their voice, and let just document it and let people decide for themselves. And definitely my experience with people watching is, people have somewhat visceral reactions to people voicing their opinions, whatever the opinions may be. That said, also, there is the discussion around age appropriateness, and that's how many people deem it, and that is a respectable, like, I get that. Like, this was a little different, and arguably I found interesting, because different than a lot of cases where someone just like absolutely thinks, this book is a work of the devil, and it should be destroyed from existence, and so on and so forth. This was a little more, like I said, I would argue interesting. Also, gets into the heart of it. Oftentimes too is like, there is an interesting discussion to be had about, how do we do that? There's no, I've said many times, I've got a 10-year-old, but along the way, he was, when I was making this, he was in the 5 to 8-ish year old, and he's very scared of a lot of things. He does not do scary stuff, and so I've never pushed these on him. That said, I also would not go to his elementary school and say no one else should have access to it in any way, shape, or form, because I know some kids that won't read unless it's something kind of on the creepy side or weird, or something that challenges them in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, I think that it was that for me, that became a pretty interesting way of getting into it, because like I said, you had a case where with Sandy, I could talk to her about her views about age appropriateness, and not be too, like I said, judgy, or just let that conversation be had and documented, and let people decide for themselves.
I thought your perspectives were very objective and unbiased. You showed a lot of different video clips from people passionately expressing their beliefs on both sides of the issue. And I thought it was a great combination of both video clips, the live interviews with the mom, as well as newspaper articles and the whole gamut, just kind of showing the different perspectives. And it was a wide range of perspectives there. It was really good. did you know you wanted to take, you said that the scary stories were what drew you to this particular topic, but you knew that you wanted to do the censorship angle of it?
Yes, I mean, that was always the beginning. I mean, for me, like, I, I, I wanted to do a documentary that, you know, that I would want to watch. And for me, like as much as I would want to watch, a certain amount of time be spent just kind of going down nostalgia lane and talking about the books and hearing people talk about them and learn a little bit about you know, the author and the illustrator and that sort of thing. At a certain point, I want controversy. I want I want you know, an argument to be had between two sides in some way, shape, or form. Meaning that adds drama. It adds from a story perspective, but it also it tells a story I haven't seen before. You know, and that's what drew me to this book series, because it had that. It was like, okay, yes, we're going to spend some time just kind of talking about the things that everyone remembers from when they were a kid, and we're definitely going to do that, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. But the censorship angle always was, you know, something that was going to be a big proponent of it, because you know, it, for me, it balances it, because a certain amount of it is building these books up as influential. And so when you take that turn at a certain point and say, okay, these seem to have been very influential to a lot of people, and they were banned, you know, then you've got an interesting discussion to be had.
So how did you find all the people that did the background with folklore and the artwork and the tattoo artists? I mean, the wide range of people who love these books. I mean, how did you find them all?
It helps that it happened over time.
Yeah.
Certainly I started the fact that these books at the back had a lot of names, which is to say, you know, you know, all the research that was done, and all these people who wrote different things about that was a starting point. So Gary Allen Fine was about the only person who's still active. He was young at the time, and he talks about how he was young at the time when it was interviewed by Alvin Schwartz. And so so that was at least a starting point. But then it's really just kind of, okay, who are people who've written books on this subject? And that's kind of where that was in a lot of ways the starting point. And those were some coming from a literature background, that was some of the more fun ones, partially because, again, you get someone who's written a book on these things, then on this topic, whatever the topic is, whether it's censorship or whether it was, you know, scary children's literature like Grimm's fairy tales and that sort of thing. You get someone who's written a book on the topic, then man, they could just wax it intellect for a good amount of time on it, and it's fun because they've done a lot of thinking about this, whatever kind of you're getting into. And so those were you know, some of my favorite parts, because it was, and there was a lot that was, so the DVD has a good 20 minutes extra. There was a lot of stuff that you know, just because I wanted to, you know, tell it at a certain pace and keep things moving along. I couldn't go down every little aside, but
were there
there's a lot there.
were there things that left you on the cutting room floor that you wished, that you really loved or wished could have been in there?
So what I'm doing now is I've got a web series. It's called Scary Studies. And I'm reaching back out to various people and saying, hey, I want to use it with this, you know, this series. I'm basically, and so they're done in 10-minute chunks. And now, admittedly, like, I'm going down other avenues. It's not I haven't done one about censorship, and I don't like, yeah, I don't know. It's more about the stories and sometimes the illustrations, but usually the stories, like, as a jumping off spot for talking about, okay, you know, what does this say about our culture? What is this? How is this interlinked with a lot of other stories, you know? And so a story like Harold, you know, it's only briefly touched on is, this kind of connection to very classic stories like Frankenstein and the Golem monster of, and how does that compare, and how are they told in different places, and what does that again say about us whenever, we use this mechanism, a theme, for different types of stories, and kind of breaking those things down. So it's been, so like I said, there's the extra 20 minutes on the DVD, but this new web series, I've done 5 or 6 episodes so far, has been kind of my way of saying, there's a lot still there, and it's just fun. This is fun. I'm kind of repackaging it in a different way than what you see in the documentary, but for sure it's kind of my way of saying there's still a lot of good stuff here. Let's put it out there in some way, shape, or form. So that's what I've been doing.
So when you talk about how the stories relate with culture and how they're told in different places and different times, we got a question from our audience, which I think goes almost perfectly with that, is the person asks, do you think the stories would gain popularity today if they were just released?
It's tricky, partially because we didn't have the internet back then, which is, there's some pros and cons to that. I make a certain amount of living on web content. But also I just know this, it's not all bad and not all good. Kids are still reading. That said, you've got things like creepypasta and stuff like that. So like, oh gosh. So do I think, I don't think it would have the same cultural, significance if it was just kind of came out of nowhere now. I think, and I think that's the case for tons of pop culture that became huge, but like hit at a certain time where that, that it was, perfect, whatever it is, I mean, same thing with, Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gamble and them, colliding and creating these particular 3 books. Well, it's not like they knew each other. They never, as far as I can tell, they never talked to each other. And so, wow. So it was kind of kismet, and it was just, it's one of those, things that I don't think it could be, would be quite the same. And, and again, it also was, it was a time, it was the 80s and 90s, which, I just turned 40 years old. I was born in 1980. And so, the late 80s, early 90s, that's prime time for, the 8 to 12-year-old range, where a lot of people, first discovered these books. Certainly there's people before and people much after that discovered these books, but it was a certain time period where, everyone talks about the scholastic book orders and that becoming, a big, huge thing, which they're still very much around. It was, there's a lot of things that have to fall into place.
The planets aligned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Totally.
Whoever connected Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gamble. Wow. Mm-hmm. We were talking about your interviews, and it's interesting. You get a lot of comments about interviewing Peter Schwartz, and you hear a couple of interviews with his wife and one with his daughter. Were there ever any thoughts about interviewing the children of the mom from the story?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, the PTA mom, the one who challenged him?
No. No, not really. Going back to what I alluded to, it was sensitive. It was sensitive. And she was in California. It was hard logistically to work out what was accomplished. So I didn't really go further.
Any feedback from parents, from people who knew her, or thoughts about?
Not
it's interesting.
Not so far. I have not heard anything.
Yeah. One of the questions that we have Um, when we talk about the 80s and the 90s and how things were back then, and then we've got the advent of the internet, how do you think the role of genre of horror in children's literature has changed over time? For example, do you think the perception is different now of the horror genre than it was in the 80s and 90s?
Oh gosh. I no, I guess, and this is just, it tends to be based on a person's attitude and whether they think the world is getting worse or getting better or isn't changing. I tend to be one of those ones where it says that thinks that things don't change so much as just have different, uh, hats. And for instance, like I was saying with creepy pasta and that sort
Mhm.
of thing, that's kind of our new folklore, right? That's our, and I'm not saying it's better or worse per se, but that's what a lot of kids are doing. They have YouTube now, so there's such a thing as memes. Well, meme is folklore, right? I mean, it's a weird type of, like, I've shared a meme here and there and stuff, but that's, you go back to the word meme, that's what it is passing on something and it taking a different form and so on. So but I think the same thing is for horror. I think there's that natural interest, right? And I don't think that's ever changed. I don't, Grimm's fairy tales became children's stories because that's who were interested in reading them. Like, they didn't originally start out that way. And so even going back then, it surprises people that, they make some kind of scary story, and it's the kids. It's not all kids, but some kids are like, oh, I want more of that, give me that,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. I mean, R.L. Stine, he didn't start out thinking that horror was the next big genre for kids literature. I mean, he was writing joke books, for kids for a number of years until he started writing scary stuff. So I think I don't think anything's changed. Kids are still interested in that. They're gonna come to it in different ways. Now they got video games, horror video games. They certainly have, plenty of YouTube and so on and so forth. So, but the interest is still there. I mean, from American Library Association's perspective, it's like, okay, let's hope that they're still reading books, right? I mean,
Mhm.
so, translate their interest into something that has some, virtue beyond, and that's really what I kind of, another reason why Scary Stories to Tell in Dark is a unique example, because it's all folklore and urban legend. So it's our history.
Mhm.
Yes, it's different than picking up a history book, but you thumb to the back and you learn that, hey, these stories were told in all these other countries and so on. I mean, that's it has additional value if you want to have those conversations with kids and say, okay, that's great that you read this ghost story. It was fun. We had some kind of connection around, a spooky story. But I can also, we could still tease more out from that. There can be a conversation to be had that goes beyond just a spook story.
Right. It's interesting too to think about how the different subgroups as kids get older have changed. So even picture books like Where the Wild Things Are, which is also banned and challenged, um, kind of as a predecessor for kids when they're younger. They have the picture books, and then that elementary age, there's that new middle grade kind of area, the YA. The Twilight books are often challenged. Of course, Harry Potter for the witchcraft and wizardry, which I wouldn't call it horror, but those same kind of elements that are in it that have caused it to be challenged for all different age ranges. And then you got the Stephen King books and the Clive Barker, and all the way into age. So I mean, into the adult ages. And it seems like horror is just one of those genres that's targeted at every age group.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, uh, and that said, as I kind of make the book, it is cyclical. It kind of goes with trends though too. So I think it's always there. I mean, because overarching, even on a larger thing, is just like, you know, being able to pull apart, you know, what's in a book and what a book is condoning, if that makes sense. You know, for instance, okay, there's violence in this book. Does it say, you know, violence is good? That's a good question. Does it say violence is good, or it does it have violence, and also what's the context, and so on and so forth. Same thing with, like you made the point in the documentary with sex. Okay, is there a sex scene? You know, is it, or you know, is that a different thing than it being pornography? I mean,
right?
You know, I mean, that's, you know, so there's a disconnect, I think, that, you know, and horror is definitely that way, where it's like, okay, you know, is there value to it? And you know, there's an argument to be, if there's no value to it, then okay, you know, maybe it's not worth a fight. Now, most of the time, and I think you find is the books we fight are the ones that do have value, and you know, we wouldn't be arguing to keep it in a school if, you know, it didn't have some kind of value. Yeah, arguably, just because, like I said, Harry Potter's a good example. It's like Harry Potter's biggest kids book almost of all time, so on and so forth. It's like, that's why we're talking about it and not some other witch book, you know, wizardry book, you know.
But I think a lot, like the principal said when the interview with Miriam, you have tens of thousands of books in your library. Why are you going to fight about just this one? Because for that one kid, this is the book that's going to change their life.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, we don't always know if it's going to be Harry Potter or if it's going to be Judy Blume or any book. You know, we tend to think of what has value to us, but we don't know what's going to have value to that other person. And that's why, as librarians, we provide such a huge selection, because, you know, and also your tastes change. What grabs you and holds onto you in 4th grade might be different in 6th grade. It's just, yeah, that one book that could just grab a kid, just make them the reader for life.
Absolutely.
It's always our librarian dreams. We fantasize about the little kid underneath the covers with the flashlight.
Absolutely.
That was me when I was a kid, with R.L. Stein books and Christopher Pike books. And
yep, same here. I was there, right there. Yep.
I remember that when I was a kid. Kristen, go to sleep. Just one more chapter. Of course, we didn't have YouTube back then either.
Yeah, exactly. So. Yep.
Here's a question for you, more about the documentary side of things. What advice would you give for future filmmakers?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, be open to your strengths and your weaknesses, if that makes sense. And so, like, you know, and so kind of appreciate, you know, what you do give, you know, what you can do well, and then also acknowledge, okay, there's some things I'm not, you know, I need someone for, so, you know, be honest about that.
What's an example in your film?
Oh gosh. I mean, me, I think I definitely had a lot of versions. And so being able to show it, some really like not great versions, to a certain select number of people, and really kind of hash it out and keep, you know, returning to it, and you know, whittling down, tighten it, and doing, you know, so on and so forth, and getting opinions, and because, yeah, I mean, you know, in this case, it was a matter of, okay, I got too much stuff, but and no, like maybe there's someone out there that wants a 3-hour cut of this, but most likely not, you know.
I do.
Yeah. So being able to have those really rough cuts early on, and then just kind of keep tinkering and find what the story is, and B, there's multiple stories, there's mini stories, there's several mini stories in the big story, you know, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you know, being able to put yourself out there and say, okay, you know, and I look back at like some very early footage, and it was a great learning experience, but it's like that didn't make the cut because, oh man, it wasn't great, you know, so on and so forth. So again, it helps to have it happen slowly, but at the same time, I guess in that I would the crux of that, I think, to some degree, is being able to put something that's not great together, and maybe that's not the final product, but show it to a few people. What do you think of this? You know, I mean, what did you like? What did you not like? And being able to take that constructive criticism, which is not something that everyone does well, but that's a big thing, you know, is being able to say, you know, have those people that say, man, I was bored out of my mind during this part or whatever. And okay, you know, do I agree with that? Also go to someone else, and if they tell you something completely different, then maybe, you know, maybe that's not the end all be all, you know, but being able to kind of take a lot of different feedback and turn it into something that's productive.
Yeah. So I've got some more questions about you personally. What are you scared of?
What am I scared? Disinformation and
Great
misinformation.
answer.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much further into that, but honestly, I mean, even when it comes to, you know, literacy and that sort of thing, that's you know, and topics such as censorship, getting the facts straight, and also, you know, not necessarily immediately globbing on to the most controversial part of it, and immediately pigeonholing and telling, okay, here's the story, because I immediately can sort it in my mind, even though because I can immediately assign a villain and hero role to certain people, and which, you know, look, I think librarians are absolute heroes, and teachers are absolute heroes, and so on and so forth. And parents are heroes, but they're also villains, and so it's but they're also neither, right? I mean, everyone's a hero of their own story, right? So you know, but yeah,
and we don't always have to stick in those roles, you know. Even the best of parents have bad days, and even the worst teachers can change their colors. So
yeah, and there's a conversation to be had with all of this, and you know, but where it goes off the rails is when it's, again, disinformation. There's just things that are just plain false. But hey, you know, I've got my opinion, so I'm allowed to just voice it, whether it's based on facts or not. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's scary.
I get that, but okay. So misinformation, disinformation, not exactly what normal people would think is scary. So do you believe in the paranormal?
No, not really. Oh gosh.
No big giant toes coming up out of the ground, or
no. Oh gosh. A death. I mean, honestly, and that was like,
yeah,
that's an easy answer, but it feeds very much into this. I mean, you know, I think, you know, how Peter Schwartz factored in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways is like, that's him, you know, 30 years later, still thinking about the death of his father, and so like, these books have kids tackle death and dying in interesting and unique ways. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely one of those people that very distinctly remembers when I was maybe 10, 12 years old or something, and I had that big realization that I'm going to die someday. Like, everyone kind of knows that, but at some point in adolescence, it hits you like a freaking freight train, and then you're up for hours at night thinking about God, and that never goes away. Like, right? Like, I guess you grow up and you keep moving on, but that's a perfectly healthy thing, both for 12-year-olds as well as adults. We've got to think that at some point we have to get up and keep living our life, but that fear of dying, that's always there, right?
Right. So obviously, Scary Stories is a favorite of yours. Do you have any other favorite banned books?
Yes. So again, my degrees are on English literature. Nabokov is one of my absolute favorites. So Lolita is as tricky as it is to talk, and that's a good example. Like, honestly, like to hear people talk about a book like that, because it's meant to be challenging. It's been challenged and it's challenging, right? But it's also one of the greatest examples of Nabokov in general is just great at meta. And I get a kick out of that, like, unreliable narrators and things like that I really geek out with and have fun reading and rereading, because it's a fun, Pale Fire is one of his others, where it's the entire thing. It's a poem, and then most of the book is notes on that poem, and the notes tell a total unreliable narrator talking about the author of this poem, who was a quote unquote friend of his, and he starts telling all these random stories, and a weird story develops in the notes of this poem, and it's totally meta. It's totally I don't know, Stanley Kubrick or something that's very weird and great. And so Nabokov's one of my favorite authors. Yeah.
Okay. Which of the Scary Stories is your favorite?
I've been asked this question a lot over the years. I think I've settled on The Big Toe. It's the first story in the first book. And it arguably is just kind of one of the more iconic ones. It's the story that Mark Twain talks about in his speeches, as far as, him is the golden arm is his. So that's kind of the overall idea of it. They're all considered golden arm stories because of Mark Twain. But he talks about how that's a good example of how to tell a story, right? It's not just what the story is, but how you tell it that is important. You could tell the big toe or the golden arm or various other iterations. 10 people could tell it. It's a completely different story. Yes, it ends the same way maybe, but you add those details and your own piece of, how you want to tell it to that story. It's a different story every time. So to me, that kind of became like indicative of all these stories, right? I mean, if I want to turn around and tell a story about the Herald or the Red Spot or something, I could tell it in a completely different way. Maybe it ends the same way. Maybe it ends as a joke story because I'm telling it to a 5-year-old, and so it's okay. It's Herald, but he ends up being goofy. He doesn't kill anyone at the end. Maybe it's something different or whatever. Maybe I introduce a little bit of spookiness, but then he doesn't skin someone in the end. He does a little jig, and it's okay because he's Harold and he's goofy. Because again, I'm telling it to a 5-year-old, but then when that kid is 10 or 12, I tell them the real Harold story or a different Harold story, and so on. So the Big Toe, like, is a good example of like, what folklore is and what's great about it.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good one. Although I never got into the eating part of it. I think I'm always going to think of that scene from the movie adaptation. Yeah.
But that's still Grimm's fairy tales, though. I mean, and Hansel and Gretel. I mean, shoot, we're talking about eating kids with that story. Most of the eating of body parts just is so very weird, but also something that kind of weirdly makes sense to kids, if that makes sense. It's something well, I mean, I think of the Halloween thing where you're supposed to put your hand somewhere and you're saying say it's their brains or their eyeballs,
right.
or whatever. I mean, again, all that kind of
spaghetti.
Spaghetti, exactly. All that stuff kind of, it's visceral, but it's also something kids immediately glob onto as they immediately can understand, I guess, in a very foundational way, they understand that. And you're not getting into, I don't know, adult like themes like greed or lust or all kinds of things. Like a 6-year-old, you talk about
zombies,
brains, and eating someone's thumb, I don't know. Again, it's something that can kind of appeal to kids if they want something on the spooky side, I guess.
Yes, definitely. So we're running low. We're getting down to our end of our time. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for not only answering some questions with us and spending some time talking, but for making this documentary. I think it shows a light of what librarians are like in defending intellectual freedom and why defending books is so important for families, communities, and our society. So I just want to say thank you for that. Can you tell us, are you working on anything right now that we get to look forward to besides the web series?
So there's a web series, Scary Studies. So I try to do those about once a month. I've got a short film that I'm working on that I'm trying to turn into a series. Still kind of early stages at this point. So I can't,
Add a lot.
So Scary Studies is kind of my go-to. Like, you can immediately go check those out, and if you like this documentary, I feel like you immediately say, oh, okay, this is just getting into spending up more time on very specific things, which I think is fun, and I think a lot of people would be interested in.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share with us before we sign off soon?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, definitely check me out on social media. I kind of took this Scary Stories doc accounts and kind of turned it into a more like future looking, they're my accounts, and so I still share a lot of scary related things, but you can definitely check me out on social media. I'm pretty active there.
Beetlejuice and Halloween stuff.
Exactly.
I love following you on Twitter.
I've said many a time, like, Banned Books Week just leads right into the season, so this is my happy time. Because I get to talk about this stuff.
I feel the same way. Scary movies and Halloween and
Yeah, totally.
So, well, thank you again for being with us tonight, and hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thanks.